Good morning, or whatever it happens to be while you're watching this. Got a lot to do today in a short amount of time, but I'm gonna try and wrap up this Civic engine job today, and it's gonna be similar to the way I've done it so far, and then I set up some cameras and edit later. But this is where we stand right now. Engine and transmission are mated up, ready to go. Everything's all bolted up and all that kind of stuff. Engine compartment is ready to accept its transmission, or its engine and transmission. So I'm ready to go there. It's really just a matter of getting this thing in here. I've got a couple hours to do it, so I'm just gonna get started. And we're back with the love it or hate it Eric the Car Guy voiceover. Back into hyper pursuit mode. Yeah, there was some people that really liked the voiceover and some people that thought they wanted more. But as I say a couple of times in this video, sometimes I just need to get the work done. But, you know, I do what I can. Anyway, moving on. So, as far as dropping this engine back in this car, normally what I would do if I had a lift is I would be dropping the car on top of the engine. I would leave the engine on some sort of roll around or something like that on the ground and drop the car onto the engine. However, without a lift, I'm not really able to do that because the engine sits up high enough and my jack stands will definitely not go up high enough to slide that engine out from underneath the car, so I have to drop it in from the top. As a result, it actually makes it a little more difficult, and looking at this footage, I think probably the way I should have done it in this instance is just raise the front of the engine up, similar to when I pulled it out. And what I have is a rag there in the distributor dipstick hole. I don't want to break the, or not distributor, the transmission dipstick hole. I don't want to break that off. But what I think I would have done if I were to do this again is I would put the transmission down, put the engine up at that angle, which I eventually sort of end up doing, drop it all down through the hole, and then bring it back up into place and connect the engine mounts. Doing it this way actually made it more difficult because what I did was I connected that back engine / transmission mount there that you can see in the footage first, and as a result I sort of locked the engine in place and I couldn't move it around. And as a result, it was really difficult to get the transmission past the, there's a subframe underneath there, and the differential part of the transmission kept binding up on it. That's the reason why I have to go get my pry bar and pry on it and move it around a little bit. But that's how this work is. I mean, it's be patient. Just, you know, take your time and just look before you just go for it, because this is some weight here and you can break some stuff. Well, here's one of the things that I ran into. The crank pulley will not come down. So I'm removing the side engine mount there, and as you can see, it dropped down quite a bit. Luckily my fingers weren't in the way, and that's all it takes is like a ½ an inch to crush a finger, so be mindful of that. Now I'm going to try to get the power steering fluid reservoir out of the way, but you see it's upside down there. You don't want to do that because that fluid will leak out that cap. So try to keep it so the fluid is, you know, gravity's your friend rather than your enemy in that situation. But what I'm going to end up doing here, and I'm moving, I had to disconnect that wiring harness to get it out, or at least unmount it from that strut tower. What I'm going to have to do here is get that crank pulley off. And here I am fighting with that differential / subframe again. And eventually I'll figure it out. Oh yeah, the engine's too big for the hole. So I jack it up and go to remove this crank pulley. Well, the thing of it is, oh yeah. I wanted to show you this. This did not work, but this can work in some situations. I've got a breaker bar with the socket on the crank pulley, and I'm hitting the back of the breaker bar with a hammer. I've done this to break things loose in tight places where I can't get an impact in. And it works sometimes in those situations, but that's why I left that in there, even though it didn't work. And here I'm using my 17 swivel socket on my ½ inch, and really when you're using an impact, you want to use like one socket. You don't want a bunch of extensions, or universals and things like that, because basically the torque gets eaten up through all those connections. And what happened right there is I just broke my socket. So now I have to find somebody from Snap-on to replace my socket now that I broke it. But see, it was just a quick zap there with the right socket. So keep that in mind should you be in a similar situation. But actually, like I said, drop the engine down through the hole and then bring it back up and get it into place. That would be a lot easier than what I'm doing here. Now when I took that off, that little keyway that locates the harmonic balancer to the crankshaft fell down. Of course, that's just what happens. It's a tiny little piece of metal, and I had to go digging around for it in the kitty litter down there, but I eventually found it. Sometimes a magnet helps. You can just run a magnet over the top of a pile of junk, and it'll suck up all the metal parts that you can pick through, find the one you need. Once again, I'm fighting with that differential in the back to try and get that past that subframe. Getting a little tricky on me, but eventually we quite literally shoehorn it down into the hole. So I know it's terribly exciting to watch it, but like I said, especially if you're there by yourself, be patient, give yourself some time, just go in small little increments, and eventually you will overcome the job. But you're not gonna just wave your magic wand and drop it down in there and everything's gonna be hunky-dory and fine. But use gravity, but use it wisely. I'm just leaving a little bit of slack in that seat belt as I'm dropping it down so that the engine can fall into place, which I believe it just did there. So now it's just a matter of rocking it back. Once again, that differential and that cross member, get Big Bertha out. That's what I call that pry bar. That's why I always have it handy, because I use it quite often. And will it? I think it will. There it is. You can see that cross member quite clear. You can see that subframe quite clearly hitting the differential down there. All right, now I've got that part done. Gonna come in and get that other mount back in, at least the rubber portion of it, and mount that to the what would that be called? I guess it's part of that, because it's a unibody construction. It's not really the frame. It's not subframes because it's not underneath. I don't know what that's called. But anyway, you can see where I'm putting it. I'm hooking it up over there where it goes. Now the bracket that goes off the front of the engine, run that in. You see I am using my impact, but I get the threads started on my fasteners before I break out the impact. You don't want to start your threads with your impact. That's a good way to cross thread stuff. So now we can shove that into place and let it down a little bit. And watch the fender cover fall off for the 50th time during this job. And sometimes I use fender covers on cars like this, not so much for the car, but for me. To protect me. But in a way, it kind of helps me visually too, because it helps me block out those things that I'm not really focused on at the time. So I do recommend the use of fender covers. It does save you from expensive mishaps a lot of times. And in some cases, on dirty cars, it keeps you from getting dirty. But hey, at this point, I see this engine is in. So I've just got this one fastener to run down. Now that engine's in there by 2 mounts on opposite sides. I'm going to tighten up the through bolt on that side. And blammo, you can see the car just took the weight of that engine and transmission. And life is beautiful. And there is that differential on that subframe again. Yay. So listen to yourself next time, Eric, and do it a different way. So, yay, it's all in. Now I'm going to park my engine hoist, hopefully for a while. This was the 3rd engine job I did in a row. And, it's funny how auto mechanics work out that way. You'll get a run of something. I had a run of engines. And everybody says, Eric, that would be a great place for a gear wrench. Well, the only gear wrench that I have is like 10 millimeter right now. So I was using it right there, and I left that in just for you that kept telling me, hey, Eric, use a gear wrench. Now, this actually answers to a question that I'd gotten from somebody, I can't remember if it was via email or whatever. And they said, Eric, when you're doing a big job like that, how do you know where to plug everything in? Well, what I do is you can just take a wiring harness like this and put it generally back in to where it was to begin with. Just sort of lay it up where you think it goes. And a lot of times the connectors will line up where they went. They have kind of a memory. It's copper, it's metal, and even though it bends and flexes, they still point themselves in the direction that they want to go. And really at this point, now that the engine is quote unquote in, it's just a matter of hooking all those back up, and there was just tightening down the injector ground. If you do a job like this and you go to start it, you find out the fuel injectors aren't working, check to see if you hook that ground up, because that's where the injectors ground, right there on the thermostat housing. Now we go into hyper pursuit mode. I got lots of comments on that. And I kind of like watching work being done like this, connecting the throttle cable, hooking that back up. Which is kind of fun. And remember the video on getting that nice and tight so that it's not too tight to where it's activating the throttle, but so that you get nice crisp throttle response from it. Now I'm hooking some things up underneath. I think that was the rear engine mount there that I was hooking up, and now there's the rest of the electrical connections on the front of the transmission. There's also another side engine mount under there that I think I'm hooking up, but the engine's much less floppy. It's not rolling back and forth like it was, so I'm pretty sure that's what I did, is I hooked that bracket up to that rear mount that's in front of the power steering rack. Not sure what I'm running in there. It could be, I have no idea what I was running in there. I really don't. There, I think I'm hooking, there's a bracket that runs from the back of the intake manifold to the back of the engine block. A lot of times in head gasket jobs, or after somebody's done a head gasket job, I see that missing. Hooking the AC back up, getting that mounted to its bracket. Didn't open any of the AC up, so I didn't have to worry about evacuating and recharging the system. Now I am setting the belt tension on the alternator. I already slipped the alternator belt on. It's the first one to go on. And I'm using Bertha here to put tension on the alternator itself while I tighten the upper fastener, and then the lower fastener, don't forget that one. It goes through that lower bracket with that little bushing that I showed you how to hit with a hammer, so you can get the alternator in and out of that bracket easier. Next up we have the AC belt, and I found out that I had been given the incorrect AC belt, which often happens on Hondas because they use two different kinds of compressors. They use a Denso, and I forget what the other one was, but they both have different size pulleys and therefore have different size belts. So I just went back and reused the old belt temporarily until I was able to get the new one. But the idea was to get this running and get this out. Reconnecting the power steering pump, and now putting the belt back on the power steering pump. There's just two fasteners that hold that onto a bracket there. That tightens up, yes, there was a little bit of power steering fluid in the holes that for the high pressure line connection. I got that out of there because you don't want liquids inside of holes, and you don't want to run bolts down into that. If you do that, you create a situation that's called hydrostatic lock. And sometimes what happens is that fluid heats up, it expands and breaks things. So I got that fluid out of there. Now the power steering pump on this one, there's a 1/2 inch square hole in the back of it that you can put a 1/2 inch ratchet into, which you saw me do, and pull back on that to get your tension. There's the feed line to the reservoir, and now I'm going with the high pressure line that I just cleared the holes out for those fasteners. I think there's a bracket on the intake that I fastened on there. A lot of stuff went on real quick there, but it's all like, just quick stuff. It's just, busy work. It's probably the best way to describe it. This is the cruise control servo. So if you ever wonder what works your cruise control, it's that guy right there. Connecting that back up. And there's some vacuum lines there too. So if you forget to do that, check those. It could create a vacuum leak and create a problem. And here's the vacuum line for the brake booster. But on this particular engine, there is one small vacuum line that's also there that goes to the back of the intake. If I'm to guess, I think that's one that goes to the cruise control. I think it wraps up around the firewall there, or bulkhead, and goes to that cruise control servo to supply it with vacuum so that it can operate. So hose clamp pliers and slide that back down. And away we go. We got our power brakes back. Yay. Fun. You get a slightly different view here. Moving my tool cart around. We've almost got this thing's butt kicked. And I think I'm nailing down that engine mount that's there by the AC bracket there. Putting the dipstick back in, because we'll need that. Now we're going to hook our coolant hoses back up. Lower radiator hose, and there's a little bracket that holds it in place above the transmission that I'm locking into place there. Now when you take these spring clamps and you put them back on when you're reusing the hoses, try to get them back in roughly the same location. I've had instances where I've tried to make them seal by just putting them back generally where they went, and they don't seal as well as they do as if you try to put the clamps back where they were, and you'll be able to see the witness marks on the hose where those things were to begin with. Now we're going to get our fuel hooked back up, and there's the return line that I'm running up underneath there to hook up to the fuel rail. So we've got the return and we've got the supply. Newer fuel systems are returnless, many of them, so they don't have a return line to go back. We'll go over that at some point. Yes, hooking up the clamps, coming in with our high pressure line. I just left that banjo fitting and washers all together on that rail so that I could find them when I needed them. And I'm tightening that by hand instead of impact there. Another heater hose, the one that goes underneath the distributor. I think I mentioned before in another video that should that get soaked with oil underneath the distributor, I often, fix the oil leak on the distributor, but I'll just cut off the affected part and just make the hose shorter, because that's a hard hose to find. Upper radiator hose connection. Once again, same little piece of advice here. Try to put the clamps back in the same position. They will seal better. But it's funny, if you do a new radiator, the hose that almost always leaks is the lower hose. For whatever reason, the lower hose always leaks when you do a radiator. I'm installing the wire loom bracket on the valve cover, and we're putting the distributor back in. It was just so much easier to hook everything else up that goes under the distributor first. And that's the way you want to work it. You want to work, from inside out, because you don't want to work yourself into a corner and make life harder for yourself. And as far as that distributor goes, it only goes on one way, but yet I have seen people with the ability to install them incorrectly. Yeah. If you get it at 180 degrees out, it will not start. And you will actually see the distributor sometimes wobble up and down. So get a good look at that. And as far as the wires go, I'm repositioning them in such a way to where none of them are touching. I really am a big fan of this. I like to make my wires as pretty as I possibly can. To me, it's professionalism, but more than anything else, you don't want to cross the wires. You don't want to keep them close together. And as far as Honda wires go, if they're the OE wires, I don't care how old they are, don't replace them. Aftermarket wires for Hondas, not so good. The best I've found is NGK. So if you're going to replace Honda wires, use NGK or the OE wires as your best bet. And note, I am using Honda transmission fluid in this transmission. Only use Honda transmission fluid and Honda automatics. I've had people make other suggestions about synthetic fluids and like that. I personally haven't tried those yet. So you can see the very cheap oil that I'm using. I don't care about cheap oil as long as the APIS service rating is the highest I can get. Many of the cheap oils are made by the same people that make expensive oils. They just don't have the same kind of additives, which may or may not benefit. But I think if you change it on a regular basis, you're good. But do not cheap out on your transmission fluid. Cheap out on your oil, replace that regularly, but don't cheap out on your transmission fluid in a Honda. That's just not the way to go. Moving the airbox back in. This guy was kind of a pain to get out, but a lot of times things go back together easier than they come apart. And this is mostly the case with this one. So hook the snorkel back up. Then I got the fresh air for the PCV to hook back up. That just slides back into its hole. I think there was a vacuum line there. And I had already sprayed some silicone spray down in the rubber mount down there. I'm just lining that up and getting that hooked in, and also getting that inlet that goes up behind the fender there, getting that hooked up to the bottom of the airbox so it's not just hanging there. And now I'm reconnecting I think that's the VTEC solenoid that I'm reconnecting there. But I'm leaving the distributor disconnected so that I can prime the engine of oil before I actually start it up. And I go over that in a little bit. The reservoir, and back to you, Eric.
Okay, here's a look from underneath. Got the AC compressor bolted back up. There were some electrical connections and things here on the transmission. Put the axles back in. Put this down pipe back on. Had to replace the exhaust manifold. But I just want you to note the shape that the exhaust is in here. This is something that the owner did. As you can see, it's in pretty rough shape. So I'm expecting some exhaust noise, but keep in mind, it's not something I did, because as far as I went was right here. But we got our transmission fluid and everything in, oil's in. All this oil was from when it grenaded. So now I'm going to pop the wheels back on, put the splash shield back up, and fire this thing up. Alright, got my coolant, oil, transmission fluid. I probably should throw a little power steering fluid in there also while I'm at it. But I've left the distributor unplugged because the car won't start without it. Just about to hook up the negative battery cable, crank it over for a little bit to get the oil circulating through it, and then we're just going to fire it up. Okay, now like I said, I just want to crank it over for a couple of seconds to get the oil circulated through it. Now let's do it for real. Distributor's reconnected. Remember, there may be a bit of noise because of this exhaust. But I don't want to crank it over anymore because I think this battery's about to die. I know why that came on. Running pretty good. Now I'm actually going to shut it off, drop the car down, and pretty much take it outside to bleed the cooling system. Alright, let's find out what's going on with this check engine light. O2 sensor heater. It's plugged in the front. We'll check the wires, but there's really not much I can do aside from replacing that O2 sensor. Now I'll bleed this cooling system out. Let all the stuff that's got to burn off of it. Nothing I can do about the O2 sensor. I checked all the wires are good, so it's quite possible that that was there before we ever started this job. We can pretty much wrap it up.
Well, I'm back for a last quick voiceover. I'm using Honda power steering fluid in the Honda power steering system. It's very important that you use Honda fluid in the power steering and the transmission. Now I'm bleeding the cooling system out, and for more details on this, see the bleeding a cooling system video and exactly what I'm doing. The smoke and junk that you see coming off the engine, normal in a situation like this. You touch things, you get grease, oil on them, like exhaust parts. They get hot, the stuff burns off, plus new gaskets, new engine stuff does that too. Now I'm just finishing up my coolant bleeding, installing the radiator cap, and I'll just take the excess from that and put it in the overflow. Yay.
Alright, now I'm going to let that sit outside and run for a bit and all that new stuff burn away. See if I can track down an O2 sensor, but it seems to be running pretty good. I'm also going to reset the ignition timing because obviously the distributor isn't going to go back in the cylinder head the same way it did in the old one. So I'll check that real quick. But, you know, minor stuff and bye-bye. Very happy to have my shop cleaned out. Very happy to be done with engine work, hopefully for a little bit, so that I'm able to do some other things. Maybe relax and do just like easy stuff like, you know, brakes and timing belts for a little bit.
It's good to have work, so I'm not complaining. I know that I went through some of those things a little quickly on this. I cut some corners on this. When you're dealing with used cars and used car salesmen, particularly independent used car salesmen, they don't ever have any money to do anything. And their margins are pretty thin, a lot thinner than you might think. You might think that there are a lot of unscrupulous car salesmen out there, and I would say a big part of the reason is because they might have chosen a very difficult profession, difficult business to make a profit in. I did it mostly for that. I did it because, you know, when there's only so much money to go around, there's only so much extra mile you could do. I know I'm justifying that, but you know what? That's how it is. That's how I see it. So if you want to talk about it, there's a place for comments below. I'm perfectly open to that. But it's together, it's running. Yes, it's got a check engine light on, but that's not my fault. In fact, that was probably there beforehand. If it wasn't, come on, O2 sensor heaters, they go out all the time. But once again, I'm not going to justify that. The fact that it runs, the fact that it's going to drive away, makes me very happy. So we're just going to leave it at that. I hope you've enjoyed this little Civic engine series, and that, you know, I know it wasn't like the traditional Eric the Car Guy, but it was something. I just, you know, there are times when I've just got to get it done. And sometimes when you're shooting the video, it takes a lot more time than it would if you were just doing the work. So this worked for me. I hope I'm able to put it together to where it's interesting and it works for you. If not, well, you know, it was an experience. It was an experiment. We tried. Let's move on. I'm Eric the Car Guy. You can always visit me at EricTheCarGuy.com or find me on Facebook and Twitter. Also, we do podcasts on Sundays with Rich Baxter from CarAndTruckTalk.com. Got new and exciting things coming your way. I'm excited to bring them to you. So keep your eyes out for that. Well, wait a minute. I might have already done that. I'm getting my videos out of order. Anyway, you can find me in those places. Oh, and now on iTunes. All right, well, that about wraps it up for the Civic engine. So remember, be safe, have fun, people, and of course, stay dirty. Ta.